got 6 words left. Does look good. That's it. Neat. Have you seen it improved?
No.
Let me show you. Okay, let's see. Is that going to be too wide? You know, Miss Nino, I think these are going to be too wide.
How many people?
We need 7.
Same.
Is Amy going to be sort of moderator?
And that's right. Keep them sitting center. I think these are too wide because we've got 3 on one table already. They might be. Let's, before you bring any more, let's see what the little gray chairs that we have out there. Let's bring a couple of those in and see how they fit. And then just out of your storage room.
Yeah, it's I've seen it.
Oh, all these taken. Well, let's see. seem to be too wide. I think those would be better. Okay, take these back in now.
Okay, they're coming around with the other.
Okay. If, we may, we won't be able to do
and waters, where feasible and practical. And here the work we did in the Carter years with Charlie's leadership to deregulate natural gas and crude oil has played an important role. It's also very much in our interest to promote and encourage the discovery and development of new oil reserves, thereby increasing the number of energy sources. These new international sources of oil supplies will likely be in regions, however, with potential instability. This is not surprising. After all, the world's most stable countries, due to that very stability, are also the ones whose fields have been most thoroughly explored. But spreading out the sources of supply and multiplying the supply lines will help to spread the risks and reduce the potential problems from a disruption in any one source. We mustn't let the present situation of energy prices being at low ebbs, some of the lowest in decades, lead us to public complacency and the danger of the loss of political interest in pursuing a wide diversification of energy sources. While exploration and development of new production areas is expensive and risky, we must maintain a clear vision and long-term thinking to explore the best prospects for significant diversification of oil supplies. Perhaps the most exciting prospect for a major addition to world oil supplies is the Caspian Sea area. While exploration is still in its early phases, indications so far are that the region's importance to world oil supply is potentially as great, if not greater, than the North Sea. When the results of more complete exploration are in, the region may indeed meet far more optimistic estimates of its potential than even this. The major obstacle to successful development of the Caspian region's petroleum reserves is developing economically feasible and reliable routes for bringing these resources to global markets. And this, in turn, is further complicated by boundary disputes between the so-called littoral states encircling the Caspian, as well as ethnic and internal disputes like Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the specter of Iran. The United States is actively promoting the establishment of an east-west or Eurasian transit corridor for the export of oil and gas from the Caspian region. It's not our intention to interfere in commercial decisions of private companies, but we do believe that realization of such a corridor will support important strategic and economic interests that we share with our European allies. We want the Caucasus and Central Asian countries to develop as independent and sovereign states. I mean, let's remember that only a few years ago these were part of the Soviet Union. And we want them to be fully integrated into the international community, enjoying unfettered access to world markets and not subject to undue influence from or dependence on any regional power. To do this, we need to avoid monopolies on export routes out of this region. And that's the reason we have promoted a policy of multiple pipelines for export of Caspian oil to the West. We want to strengthen global energy security through development of these new sources of supply and to ensure that Caspian export routes, which will also end up going to Pakistan and other countries in South Asia, to diversify rather than to be concentrated. Sending additional oil from the Caspian through the Straits of Hormuz makes no sense whatsoever from an energy security standpoint. The Bosphorus provides a commercially attractive option for exporting Caspian oil. But Turkey feels very strongly, and we share this feeling, that their straits cannot handle all the oil that producers would like to ship through it. Without some mechanism for regulating access to the Bosphorus, or by building pipelines that bypass altogether the Bosphorus, commercial forces could drive ever greater volumes through the Bosphorus and increase the risks of an accident that Turkey wants to avoid. This, in turn, could precipitate a confrontation between Turkey and other Black Sea states and a potential disruption of shipments important to world energy supply balance. We therefore believe that an east-west energy transportation corridor, including a pipeline from Baku in Azerbaijan to Ceyhan in Turkey, and a trans-Caspian gas and oil pipeline, is an important feature in addressing our strategic concerns. A Baku-Ceyhan pipeline will give the producing countries of the region a diversification of export routes. It will also allow Caspian energy resources to serve to diversify energy sources for consuming countries and will avoid putting more oil through the Bosporus. Turkey supports such an option. A trans-Caspian gas pipeline, which links Turkmenistan's gas reserves through the Caucasus to Turkey, also has a number of strategic advantages. In addition to gas from Turkmenistan, it could include gas from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. It could incorporate Russian gas, providing an important Russian role in the transportation corridor. And it could help solve the energy shortages which have plagued Georgia and Armenia. And by including Russia and Armenia, a Caucasus route could also give them a vested interest in pipeline security for both gas and oil pipelines. We want Caspian energy to diversify world energy supplies. And as a matter of policy, and I want to state this very clearly, the United States strongly opposes any pipelines across Iran due to Iran's support for terrorism and its drive to acquire weapons of mass destruction and the missile technology to deliver those weapons of mass destruction. Such pipelines could give Iran an undue influence over the development of the Caucasus and Central Asian countries, as well as important transit revenues. In addition to satisfying strategic concerns, the East-West corridor should offer compelling commercial advantages, particularly to those companies which intend to have a long-term presence in the Caspian. By not relying on the Bosporus, the Baku-Ceyhan line can be a long-term solution to the region's export needs. This could be an important consideration to a company which hopes to discover additional oil in the region. Similarly, a trans-Caspian gas pipeline that would go through and under the Caspian Sea could be important to any company that might develop gas reserves in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. If Turkmenistan exports its gas through Iran, as we do not wish it to do, instead of using a trans-Caspian route, then Azeri and Kazakh reserves could be stranded for the foreseeable future because they're not sufficient in and of themselves to sustain a pipeline. We're hopeful that Turkmenistan, whose president will be visiting Washington this month, will support a trans-Caspian rather than an Iranian route. Let me briefly mention one other region, and that is Latin America. The focus in Latin America is not on countries newly emerging as petroleum exporters, but rather on dramatic increases in production on the part of the region's long-term producers, particularly Venezuela, Colombia, Trinidad, and potentially Mexico. Venezuela has massively increased its production and exports. Colombia has doubled its production to about 600,000 barrels per day and has been the location of most of the recent major new discoveries in the region. And Trinidad, long a significant petroleum producer and refiner, is now achieving prominence as an exporter of liquefied natural gas. Due to continuing major advances in technology for deep water exploration, drilling, and production, U.S. oil and gas development has been moving deeper and deeper into the Gulf of Mexico. Increasing U.S. production from the Gulf, currently at about 2 million barrels per day, is likely to go to 3 million barrels per day or more in the near future and gives us a source right at our doorstep for this diversification, which is so important. Just as we're working to diversify our sources of energy, so too we must search for increased productivity. And one way to do that is through increased energy efficiency. We made great strides in energy efficiency from 1970 through 1985. Energy consumption per dollar of GDP fell by almost 25%. But since about 1986, there have been no further gains in energy efficiency. There are several reasons why a renewed emphasis on energy efficiency should be an element of our national energy policy as well. First, it simply makes good economic sense to get the most value out of any economic input. In addition, since imported petroleum is a major component of our energy mix, using petroleum-based energy more efficiently will reduce our reliance on foreign supplies, and the largest contributor, people often ignore this, to our trade deficit is our imported oil. And last, energy efficiency can contribute importantly to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as we've committed to do at the Kyoto Climate Change meeting. I saw, by the way, just in the paper today, flying in from Washington, one of Mobil's regular ads, and they emphasized energy efficiency and the fact that this would in turn reduce greenhouse emissions, and that's very much welcome. Efficiency improvements alone could lower greenhouse gas emissions by more than 6%. This problem, by the way, which will touch all of us in future generations, that is, the issue of climate change, will not go away. I want to close by talking about sanctions, because within the context of energy policy, one of the most powerful, if controversial, foreign policy tools is the use of economic sanctions and embargoes. There's been some increased focus from our friends and allies on sanctions stemming from two recent sanction laws: the Libertad Act, or as it's sometimes called, the Helms-Burton Act with respect to Cuba, and the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act, which we call ILSA. There's also been emphasis and focus here at home as well on the general subject of sanctions as an emphasis broader than just those regimes covering Iran, Libya, and Cuba. There is a clear increase in the number of studies, conferences, discussions, and debates like the one taking place today on the subject of economic sanctions. More precisely, there is an increasing and I think healthy focus on the question of the effectiveness of unilateral economic sanctions. It's clearly in any administration's interest to improve the effectiveness of its policies and to provide enhanced clarity on its goals and objectives. As Ambassador Dirigian said, sanctions is not new. Indeed, it's as old as society itself. But in this age of heightened political and economic global integration, sanctions are becoming an increasingly important tool, midway between diplomacy on the one hand and military action on the other, for enforcing international norms and standards of behavior. We use sanctions for a variety of purposes: to change the behavior of a target country, to signal disapproval of a government's behavior, as a necessary early reaction, and sometimes as a warning that even harsher measures, including military action, might follow, to limit a target country's freedom of action, and to increase the cost of engaging in unacceptable behavior. These purposes in turn serve a range of policy objectives: support for human rights, including worker rights and religious rights, promotion of democracy, anti-terrorism, narcotics, nuclear non-proliferation, and environmental protection. Over the years, there have been a number of important developments. First, the use of sanctions is clearly on the rise. It may surprise you to hear these figures. The United States has applied sanctions for foreign policy reasons a total of 115 times since World War I. Of these, 104 have occurred since World War II. And of these, 61 have occurred between 1993 and 1996. So in the period of only 3 years, more than half of the sanctions this country has used in virtually this entire century have been employed. These cover now some 35 different countries. And these don't include the use of sanctions at state and local levels, which are also on the rise, like the Massachusetts sanctions involving Burma. The United States is not alone in using sanctions or in its increasing use of sanctions. For example, in the United Nations, the Security Council imposed sanctions only twice between the end of World War II and 1990, on Rhodesia and South Africa. Between 1990 and 1996, however, the UN itself imposed mandatory sanctions on 8 different countries. Economic sanctions, of course, are only one of many foreign policy tools that we can use. Many measures are available when we have objections to another country's conduct. Everything from withdrawing an ambassador, reducing an embassy staff, denying visas to target figures, to, of course, the application of military force, and everything in between. But the challenge we face in the foreign policy arena is the same that is faced in the business world: finding the best mix of measures to accomplish our objectives at the least cost. So back to our question: are sanctions effective in this regard? Well, for one thing, they're certainly not costless. Economic sanctions impose a cost on the country imposing the sanctions, not simply on the country on whom they are imposed. The President's Export Council, for example, recently estimated that the direct cost of economic sanctions to the U.S. economy in 1995 was between $15 and $19 billion in lost export sales and up to 250,000 lost jobs. It also argued that sanctions have an indirect effect through undermining confidence in the reliability of U.S. suppliers and providing a competitive advantage to our foreign competitors. There have been a number of recent studies which have leveled criticism at the way we as a government deal with sanctions and sanctions issues. Sanctions, particularly unilateral economic sanctions, which we impose ourselves, not with other countries, are often seen by critics as undisciplined, poorly targeted, or ineffective, or some combination. Alternatives such as diplomatic measures, sometimes more effective, they say may not always be fully considered. And the cost to the U.S. economy and U.S. competitiveness, these critics argue, is disproportionate to the results achieved. State and local sanctions, it is also argued, may conflict with our international obligations and confuse our foreign policy goals. I suppose if I were a governor, I'd much rather be in charge of foreign policy for a state than welfare reform, but that can sometimes cause confusion with respect to where the United States stands on a particular issue. Unilateral sanctions can put the U.S. on the political defensive and shift attention away from the problem to the sanctions themselves. Now, of course, we're aware of these criticisms, and we find value in some of them, and we will factor them into our future work. Secretary Albright has directed me to establish, and we have established in the Department of State, a department-wide sanctions team which is examining principles and policy options to make sanctions more effective as a tool of foreign policy. This is a team that is off and running now. We're also working within an interagency context with Treasury and Commerce, Trade Representative's Office, and others to examine more broadly the role of economic sanctions in our foreign policy process. The challenge is to find a way to improve the way we make sanctions decisions, to ensure that sanctions are part of a coherent strategy, to accurately measure the costs and effects of sanctions measures, to seek a multilateral support where possible, and to have better coordination between the Congress and the administration, because frankly, a vast number of the sanctions that have been initiated since 1993 have not come from the executive branch. They've come from the Congress, and we find ourselves being reactive rather than proactive. The business community is at last making its voice heard. A group called USA Engage has been formed with over 600 companies, and it is focusing on the issue of bringing more rationality into the sanctions area. They've also sponsored legislation that has been introduced by Senator Lugar in the Senate and Congressman Crane and Congressman Hamilton in the House that is trying to do for the legislative branch, for Congress, what our sanctions team is trying to do for the executive branch. That is, to have a more effective methodology for looking at sanctions, for doing more of a cost-benefit analysis, to look before we leap. There are also some current congressional initiatives which call for the employment of economic sanctions, which we can't support in their current form. Although they may have been introduced to address problems of great concern, the automatic imposition of economic sanctions may not be the best way to influence behavior. Now, one such bill is the issue of so-called freedom from religious persecution, the Wolf-Specter Act. We have been very, very active in putting religious freedom as a key priority in our foreign policy. The Secretary has incorporated it very much into her foreign policy goals. We're going to be appointing a special person working with the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights to deal with this issue. For the first time, our annual human rights report identified countries by name, some 78, which have various problems with respect to religious discrimination. But this bill is not the way to advance the goal that we hold in common with the sponsors of the legislation, namely promoting religious freedom around the world. The bill's automatic sanctions, with virtually no real presidential discretion, could cover as many as 75 countries. They would be a blunt and counterproductive instrument which would risk hurting victims of religious discrimination, whose governments might take out on them the fact that sanctions are being imposed. And they would make constructive human rights dialogue with the affected governments almost impossible. This would wreak havoc with our foreign policy and would not advance the goals of religious freedom, quite the contrary. Several principles are already apparent to guide our search for a more effective way to integrate sanctions into foreign policy. First, we should resort to sanctions only after we have exhausted diplomatic initiatives. And we should be sure that we can't succeed with diplomatic initiatives before we take a sanctions option. Second, if traditional diplomacy doesn't work, our next option should be trying to develop a multilateral sanctions regime with other countries for two reasons. Reason number one is that by definition, by getting more countries involved, you're more likely to have an impact on the target country than if the United States is only imposing the sanctions themselves, even though it has to be said when you're doing it multilaterally, you may have to compromise on the severity of the sanctions. So it's nice to be able to do something really tough if you do it alone, but you're more likely to be effective if you can get other countries involved, even if the level of sanction may not be as high as you wish. But there's a second advantage to multilateral sanctions, and that is it is less disadvantageous to American business because other companies from other countries are also barred from doing business with the target country, and therefore we're not put at a competitive disadvantage. There will be other instances, however, where we have tried diplomacy and it's failed. We have tried to put a multilateral regime together, Iran would be an example, and we did not succeed. In that case, unilateral sanctions are a legitimate option. They may be the only way, even if imperfect, for us to express our concerns and to try to affect policy and ultimately perhaps to pull other countries along. We do have a moral voice in the world. We do sometimes have to stand alone. But if we're going to go down that unilateral route, we ought to do so in a considered way. Will the unilateral sanctions work? Do they state some value which is preeminent and makes us go along alone even if no others follow? How long will they last? How do we test the effectiveness of it? These are the kinds of questions that we need to look at increasingly when we do unilateral sanctions. And again, there clearly is a role for them. We've done them in the Sudan and in Burma quite recently. We can't give other countries a veto over our ability to act. Again, at the same time, they should be designed carefully so that the target country feels the pain and unnecessary hardships to the innocent are prevented. And they should be constructed so as to minimize the cost to the U.S. and our allies while extracting the maximum leverage on the country whose conduct we're trying to affect. Whether we act alone or in concert with others, we should analyze before we penalize, study in advance the specific purpose, enforceability, cost, and likely effect of any decision to impose sanctions. Well, it's obvious in stating these factors, you can't have a one-case-fits-all situation. You can have a methodology and a process and factors and guidelines, but those necessarily will have to be adjusted and adapted to the particular situation. If our policies are to be effective, we must work together, the administration and the Congress, state and local governments, the business community, and non-governmental organizations, to see that our use of sanctions is appropriate, coherent, and designed to attract international support. As the world becomes more interdependent, as we move forward to establishing acceptable codes of international behavior and the will to enforce them, the effective application of sanctions can be a real asset if they're properly applied. Much work remains to be done to sharpen our ability to use sanctions, to be able to parse out when they are effective and when they're not. Forging consensus both at home and with our allies on how we should proceed won't be quick and it won't be easy. But this shouldn't dissuade us from improving our ability to act effectively to employ this asset. I frankly believe that as we in government work to hone the sanctions tool, we'll benefit from the thoughts and suggestions of groups like the Baker Institute, from the Congress, think tanks and universities, business organizations, and others. The more input and the more debate, and that's really one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here, the better the suggestions and ideas we will have to be more effective in achieving our foreign policy objectives and serving our national interests. Thank you very much. I think we're going to start a question period, and if I may be permitted one story to tell at the beginning of the question period that was told to me by someone that I had worked very closely with when I was in the Carter White House, and that is Senator Russell Long. I'm sure Mrs. Baker remembers Senator Long. Very colorful senator from Louisiana who was a longtime chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, responsible for much oil and gas legislation and tax legislation. And Russell told me that when he was a young boy growing up in the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, when Papa was the governor, and his papa was Huey Long, the so-called kingfish, even more colorful populist governor of Louisiana in the 20s and early 30s. That Papa, he said, came home stone drunk one night and just staggered up the stairs of the governor's mansion, and then with great difficulty reached into his coat pocket to pull a key out to open the door to the governor's mansion. And with a very shaky hand, finally got the key in the keyhole to align and turned the key, the door opened, and Russell, then holding on to Mama's apron strings, remembered Papa just collapsing on the foyer with Mama with her hands crossed, looking down for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have occurred to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said he remembered Papa saying the following to Mama: "Mama, I have now completed my prepared remarks, and I'll take questions from the floor." So in a slightly different state, I'll take questions from the floor.
Okay.
Could you wait for the microphone to come up to you, and then please stand and...
Nabil Al-Kuwaiti, Delta Oil Company. Mr. Eizenstat, if, as seems likely, Israel withdraws unilaterally from South Lebanon and Iran seizes or reduces considerably support for Hezbollah in the south, what is the possibility, under those circumstances, that there will be a partial lifting of U.S. sanctions against Iran before the end of the year in order to encourage it, say, to take a different stand with respect to weapons of mass destruction or other issues that are at issue right now?
Well, first, while Israel has just within the last 24 hours accepted the UN resolution with respect to withdrawal, there are certain conditions that still have to be met by other parties, which may or may not be met. So I don't think we should consider that a foregone conclusion, although it is certainly a useful development that Israel is considering this. Second, we have no evidence that Iran is in any way diminishing its support for Hezbollah. If that were to occur, it obviously would be an important development. I think the best way to answer your question is to put it into a more general context with respect to Iran. And that is, one would have to be tone deaf, and we're not, to avoid hearing different messages coming from the Khatami regime. We're cognizant of those. We recognize that in the placement of people in the cabinet and his own statements, that there is a potentially different voice coming out of Iran. The President has been personally responsive to that, as has the Secretary of State. The President has welcomed those comments. The President has said that he would consider possible cultural exchanges. We've already had a wrestling team, and other things may be considered. And indeed, the President has actually called for a government-to-government dialogue, which unfortunately has not been accepted at this point by the Khatami government. The problem is, as promising as some of those straws in the wind may be, they're not reflected in any change in conduct in the external and foreign policies of Iran. We see no diminution in their support for radical groups that are trying to explode the Middle East peace process. We see no diminution in their efforts to acquire weapons of mass destruction and the missile systems to deliver them. And we have no evidence at this point that the President has control over the foreign policy and security regime. So what we're looking for is a change not just in mood music, but in actual behavior and conduct. Until that time occurs, we have to keep our guard up, we have to keep our current policy, while, again, recognizing that there are different voices and trying in an appropriate way to respond to them.
Jack?
Mr. Secretary, you yourself mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh. Could you discuss briefly the U.S. policy in light of the events in Yerevan and the importance of the entire region to American interests?
We've taken a very active role in Nagorno-Karabakh. There is a Minsk group process which is very much at work. We are actively engaged. There are some positive developments in terms of Armenia and Azerbaijan coming to some beginnings of an outline for how to deal with the problem. Those who live in Nagorno-Karabakh have not at this point bought onto that process, and that is one of the challenges that we have. At the same time, we feel that it is extremely counterproductive to our ability to act as an honest broker in this process and to have more of a catalytic role in bringing about a resolution of that problem, which is very important to the development of energy resources in the area as well as peace and stability, by the so-called 907 restrictions which the Congress has imposed on our assistance to Azerbaijan. We feel very strongly that these restrictions are inappropriate, counterproductive, and ought to be removed. And in testimony that Secretary Talbot and I gave just this very week, we argued very strongly to the Senate that those remaining restrictions, which were slightly eased up on last year, should be removed. So I can't say that there is a breakthrough, but there is some reason for thinking that progress can be made, and we can make a lot more if we're freed from the restrictions that 907 provides.
Professor Muskowski.
I would like to ask a question about the global warming treaty. Is that allowed?
It's permitted. It's getting hotter in here every minute, so.
There was a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Richard Cooper, which I personally find persuasive, that arguing that the Kyoto agreements are likely to fail unless the administration shifts its enforcement or implementation mechanism away from emission permits to a system of carbon taxes. And the basic argument is that the developing countries that are likely to grow very rapidly and to their emissions will grow rapidly, are very unlikely to agree to any explicit quantity restrictions, which appear to be on the face of it a necessary condition for the emission approach. I wonder if you could comment.
Well, if I wanted to be coy, I would say by the next edition of Foreign Affairs, where you'll see my rejoinder to it, but I'll give you a sneak preview on what I'm going to say. First of all, Mr. Cooper was both an assistant secretary, actually an undersecretary for economic affairs in the State Department, one of my predecessors. His picture is still on my wall. I don't throw darts at it, even with the article that he wrote. And I'm sure Charlie Duncan remembers working with Dick as well. I mean, Dick's solution to the climate change problem is an internationally imposed massive carbon tax, which is not a rational, politically saleable, or economically advisable option. The climate change agreement achieved what I would call about 2.5 of the 3 objectives we had. The first, and all of this depends, by the way, on the premise that we accept the scientific data, which I think is now irrefutable, that there is in fact a massive buildup of greenhouse gases and of carbon dioxide. And we have this from actual core samples taken from glaciers, as well as Hawaiian measurements that have been done over the last 20 years, that there is an increase in temperature and that there can be severe dislocations over the next century if we don't begin to act on this in a prudent way now before there's a crisis. Objective number 1 was to develop rational and economically realistic targets and timetables. And so we achieved our timetable of 2008 to 2012 before the first budget period goes into effect, which is later than other countries wanted, to give our industry more time to adjust. We got multiple year targets, so a company doesn't have to hit a single target in a single year, but can average, which makes it easier to do. And we got a level of reduction that was actually less than the European Union is imposing on itself, and basically even with what the Japanese and Canadians and our other major competitors are taking. Second, we wanted to develop, contrary to what Mr. Cooper proposed, flexible, market-driven mechanisms to achieve the timetables rather than a top-down regulatory approach or huge carbon taxes. And so the centerpiece of Kyoto, and what I think was our most significant achievement, was the concept of trading rights, which massively reduced the cost to the United States of achieving our objectives. That is to say that within all those countries in the developed world who have taken on obligations to reduce their emissions, you can trade emissions rights as you would stock, and as we already do under the acid rain program domestically, so that, for example, a utility in Texas or Ohio which may exceed its limits could purchase from a utility in Russia or the Ukraine permits at a much lower cost to achieve its goals than having to reduce its own levels of emission. We also got other very innovative features in, for example, something called sinks. Sinks are carbon-absorbing activities. So, for example, in the Kyoto Agreement, the United States, which is a major, perhaps the most major country in the world dealing with forests, a reforestation program and the planting of trees gives this country a credit against its obligations because those trees absorb carbon. The more trees we plant, the more offsets we get. We also developed something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which will give a company in the developed world, let's again say an Ohio utility, the right to co-venture and develop a gas-fired power plant in China or Indonesia and get a credit back against its own obligations. All of these, I think, are much better mechanisms, more market-driven mechanisms, than Dick Cooper's concept of a huge carbon tax. Now, the area we failed, although not fully, was in getting developing countries to participate. And with respect to developing countries, the President has said he will not submit a treaty for ratification until we have meaningful participation by developing countries, because they will be the biggest emitters in the 21st century. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, this is Hushang Amir Ahmadi, Rutgers University. I have spent the last 6 years with a group of colleagues on U.S.-Iran relations. We were very pleased until today that everything is going right, but unfortunately you were quite disappointing in terms of development with Iran. I thought a lot of positive things are developing. But I have one question for you, and this is the question that concerns us the most, perhaps. So far, U.S.'s concerns about Iran was its behavior, terrorism, nuclear issue, peace process, and it seems to me that many of these issues are resolving themselves, in the due process. Iran has already denounced terrorism, and in the last at least several months, there hasn't been any incident of terrorism connected to Iran. It seems to me that Mr. Khatami has sent a private message through Mr. Yasser Arafat to Mr. Clinton expressing its opinion, saying that Iran has no intention to intervene in that process. And on the nuclear issue, Iran has been trying its best to see if it can work with U.S. on some within some model, North Korea or whatever. But the question I have is this. I heard that certain American friends in Central Asia and the Caucasus are telling the administration that please do not lift the sanction against Iran, because Iran will be a devastating competition for investment in those areas. After all, if you open up Iran, most energy firms are going to just jump on the Iran's wagon, and Iran by itself is bigger than all those other states when it comes to energy and so on. Is that something that is developing as another obstacle to U.S.-Iran relations?
Well, these are good questions, and let me answer them in two parts. First, I wish I could agree with you, but I can't, that the issues that we are concerned about are resolving itself. We do not see evidence that Hezbollah has been, or Islamic Jihad has been cut off from funding by Iran. We see continued evidence that Iran is testing longer and longer range missiles and developing weapons of mass destruction. With respect to the sanctions that you relate, I can assure you that the sanctions which are imposed on Iran have nothing to do with trying to achieve a competitive advantage for the United States and the Caspian relative to Iran. When and if Iran changes its behavior in a demonstrable way, you will see our policies toward Iran change in a comparable way. Now again, I'm trying to be completely candid and balanced in this and suggest to you that clearly Khatami seems to come out of a different mold than his predecessors. But until we see that translated more directly into not simply private assurances to Yasser Arafat, but actual conduct on the ground, we would be ill-advised to change our policy.
There are many questions, but I think your time is, we'll take one last question, a lady here.
Sir, I think any good relationship between two countries involve good intention on the part of both countries. Besides calling a country of 65 million people a terrorist nation and putting sanction, which has always been very counterproductive, what kind of moves has the United States made? What kind of positive move the United States has made to improve relationship with Iran? Remember, until the Carter administration, until the end of the Carter administration, Iran was one of the closest allies of the United States, and it is absolutely in the best interest of the United States to improve relationship with Iran. Thank you very much.
Well, certainly no one has to remind me that through the middle of the Carter administration, Iran was our best friend and became one of our most significant problems. I think Charlie Duncan and myself are very well aware of the change. I would say with respect to this administration, the Clinton administration, the President has said time and again, even before Khatami's election, that we were willing to engage in a government-to-government dialogue so long as it was open, so long as all issues could be on the table, so long as it was transparent, so that we can discuss our differences. After Khatami's CNN interview, which is how one makes foreign policy these days, I guess, after Khatami's CNN interview, the President almost immediately responded. He responded by indicating that this exchange, as Khatami put it, of civilizations is something that we would welcome. We're working on ways in which to make that concrete. I mentioned the wrestling team. I mean, you remember we started with China with ping pong diplomacy. So the grunt and groan boys, I guess, maybe are this equivalent. But, you know, we are willing to broaden this when we work out the modalities and if there's a willingness on the other side. And then the President repeated again in the same context that not just should we have an exchange of so-called civilizations, but we ought to have a government-to-government exchange. And this was turned down. So, you know, again, we are not tone deaf. We haven't ignored whatever signals are to be sent. We've tried to advance the ball. We think, in fairness, the ball is in their court now. We've called for more cultural exchanges. We've called for a government-to-government dialogue. We've called for an end in a demonstrable way to the conduct which I've described. And we're hoping for a response in any of those areas.
Stu, we want to thank you, but we can't let you go away without a present for you and Fran. And I assure you, as a federal government official, it is under the limits that you can accept. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm always in the embarrassing position when I get these of having to assume that my hosts are cheap. But again, I want to end the way I started. It's really a privilege to be here, to see this building. I remember talking with Ed some years ago when this was just a dream in Jim and Susan Baker's minds, and it's really wonderful to see the establishment that has been built here, and to have this kind of a conference, I think, is extremely welcome, and I think it's a testament to both the public service that Jim Baker and Ed Dirigian have given, and I hope you'll have a good conference and you'll have some good conclusions to present to us, because we're dealing obviously with some very difficult issues at a very seminal time. We're at a seminal time. The world is changing. Things are changing in Iran. The question is how fast, what should our reaction be, and that's what we're looking at now. Thank you very much.